True Crime Brewery contains disturbing content related to real-life crimes. Medical information is opinion based on facts of a crime and should not be interpreted as medical advice or treatment. Listener discretion is advised.
Hey, welcome to True Crime Brewery. I'm Jill.
And I'm Dick.
With little medical training and no scientific basis for her treatments, Dr. Linda Hazzard was able to attract many wealthy clients to her Institute of Natural Therapeutics in Olalla, Washington. Dorothea and Claire Williamson, wealthy sisters from England, read Dr. Hazzard's book, Fasting for the Cure to Disease, and they believed that this was their path to true health. 2 months after starting the treatment, Dorothea and Claire each weighed about 70 pounds. By the time family members were summoned to the Institute, Claire was dead and Dorothea weighed 50 pounds. She was unable to care for herself anymore as she endured starvation, daily enemas, and beatings. In addition, Dr. Hazzard had been appointed the executor of Claire's estate and the legal guardian of Dorothea. Investigations revealed that Dr. Hazzard was responsible for the deaths of many of her patients. Join us at the quiet end for a story of greed and sadism in a time when pseudoscience and questionable medical practices went virtually unchecked. In today's episode, Hunger, we will try to understand the mentality that led these otherwise sensible people to believe in Dr. Hazzard, even as she slowly killed them. So this case is just infuriating to me. I think we're going to have a good discussion. So I hope you brought a tasty beer.
I did. I even brought a beer from the same area. This is Space Dust from Elysian Brewing Company in Seattle. Space Dust is an American IPA, 8.2% alcohol by volume. This beer is clear gold, big huge white head, a little bit of lacing, aroma of pine mostly, a little bit of citrus, and a lot of sweet malt. This had a mostly piney taste, a little bit of grapefruit, and a very good caramel background. In fact, this is pretty much of a malt-forward IPA. It's not that hoppy.
All right, it sounds good. Let's open it up.
Okay.
Okay, Dickie, let's take this beer down to the quiet end of our spare bedroom.
Okay.
Now, I was thinking when people listen to these podcasts years from now, if anybody does, they're going to say, oh yeah, that was back in the quarantine of 2020.
That's what they'll say.
Yep, it's living history going on here.
Yeah, this is our third or fourth episode we've done since being under the quarantine.
Yes, I know, it's very different.
It sure is.
Yeah, but I like these historic crimes and I'm going to really enjoy this conversation. Although, like I said, it pushes some buttons for me. It really makes me angry. I'm sure it does you too, as a physician, right?
Well, we've got a person portraying herself as a physician. That always gets your goat.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just, she's a horrible person.
Yeah, just a mean bitch, really.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, well, why don't you go ahead and get us started?
Well, as you said, Jill, this is an old case. It's from over 100 years ago.
I know, amazing.
It is. So Linda Burfield was born in Carver County, Minnesota in 1868. She was the oldest of 7 kids. Her mother, Susan, was a Canadian. After Linda's father died in the Civil War, Susan married a man named Montgomery Burfield. Linda was an energetic girl. She was known as a tomboy, showing more interest in outdoor activities than in the activities more suitable for a proper young woman.
In the year of the late 1800s.
Right.
Yeah. Yep.
Linda believed that her early criticisms of the medical establishment were developed by the mistaken beliefs of a medical doctor who visited on the Burfield children once a year. So this doctor convinced the Burfield parents that their children were silent victims of dangerous intestinal parasites. Pills were prescribed, and these brought on painful episodes of vomiting and diarrhea. As she grew into an adult, Linda claimed the pills had done irreparable damage to her gastrointestinal tract, and these required her to give herself daily enemas.
Yeah, and that's bad, right? Can't you set your electrolytes just off doing that? That's bad to do that.
It certainly is. I
Yeah.
mean, the kind of best thing that can happen is you get dependent on the enemas. You're not able to have a bowel movement on your own. You're depending on the enemas to do it. But depending on what fluid is in there, water is the simplest, right?
Yeah, that's usually what it was from what I read.
So what'll happen is you'll get some fluid absorbed into the body, kind of dilute things out, causing problems.
Yeah. So this was a big thing with her, though.
Yeah, she was a real believer in these enemas.
Yes. So Linda married a man named Edwin Perry when she was just 18, and the couple settled in Fergus Falls and had 2 kids. Her son Roland was born in 1889, and her daughter Nina Floy was born in 1891. According to court records in Hennepin County, Minnesota, Edwin Perry had abandoned Linda and their children in 1898, leaving her with no support. So a divorce was finalized in 1902. Linda resumed using her maiden name, and her son and daughter she just sent off to live with their grandmother, Susan Burfield. Her dad, Montgomery, had died in a logging accident years earlier. So it seems that the children were just kind of in the way of Linda's ambitions for a career as a fasting specialist. While her son would return later to be with her, her daughter held a grudge against her mother, and they never reconciled. Many people who knew Linda also believed that it was she who left Edwin. Once she had a family, she just decided it wasn't what she wanted. She had a higher calling, and she was going to be this fasting specialist. So she began by studying osteopathy with plans to work as a nurse. But then a book written by Dr. Edward Dewey changed everything for her. In it, the doctor promoted the therapeutic benefits of fasting.
Dr. Dewey had treated a typhoid fever case where the routine treatment had failed. Then he decided to let nature take her course and prescribed a fast. After 34 days, without really any significant nourishment, just fluids, the patient recovered. So this was the extent of Dewey's scientific research, exactly one patient. Dewey wrote what would become a famous essay on health and diet titled The No Breakfast Plan. Linda contacted the doctor, and she convinced him somehow that she would be the best person to carry on his legacy.
Oh, I think she was good at convincing people of things. She was very charming, manipulative, able to do that. And we'll find out a lot more about that as she gets older.
We will. So Linda and Dewey worked closely together. They had one area of disagreement, and that was the use of enemas as an internal bath to cleanse the bowels. Dewey thought that the bowels should be allowed to function naturally, but Linda was a strong proponent of enemas. Now, after Dewey died, Linda opened her own practice in Minneapolis. According to Linda, people with serious diseases that medical doctors couldn't cure recovered under her care. And she cured people of such things as diabetes, infectious diseases, and even paralysis.
Well, I mean, she was pretty much claiming she could cure anything, right?
Sure. You name it, I can fix it.
Yes, everything came from food, was the whole theory that she was practicing by.
Yeah.
Yeah, but, I mean, her education, like I said, was very limited.
It was. Just a few words about how she started calling herself a doctor. She essentially was grandfathered in, because back in the day, over 100 years ago, there wasn't any real regulation. If you wanted to be a doctor, you just called yourself a doctor.
It's
Easy.
really hard to imagine.
Isn't it?
Yeah.
So over time, years and years, it got to be where you needed to have a medical degree from an accredited medical school, and you needed to take a test in the state that you wanted to practice in. Now, somehow, Linda was grandfathered in as a doctor on the basis of her osteopathic training in becoming a nurse, or to become a nurse. And I have no idea how that happened, just that she was granted a medical license.
Well, I mean, regulations were just completely inadequate. It was a real shit show. It just wasn't. It wasn't organized.
Well, there were regulations. It's just that they weren't followed.
Well, sure.
Or they were overlooked.
Right. Well, sure.
But she was. She called herself a doctor, even though she had no degree.
And she had a presence. She carried herself as if she knew everything, and a lot of people believed her.
Sure.
I mean, half of life is convincing people of something that you are.
Uh-huh.
So in 1903, Linda's future husband, Sam Hargrave, was engaged to a young lady named Viva. And Sam had agreed to take a position in the Minneapolis office of American Credit. The plan was that Viva would join him as soon as he was financially settled. So he told Viva that her patience would be rewarded with a wedding and a life of love and happiness. So she stayed back home in the country. And this Sam was a charmer. He sent Viva love letters almost every day of the week, and that March he wrote to her asking her to travel to Minneapolis. He said that he regretted that he was unable to send her any money for her trip, but he professed his love for her and his desire for the two of them to spend their lives together. So, much like Linda, Sam can convince just about anybody of anything. So Viva's madly in love with him, and when she arrived in Minneapolis, he was there. He had asked his boss for an afternoon off to meet some friends and not mentioned that Viva was coming or that they had wedding plans. But they married that day in the courthouse after Sam told the Justice of Peace he better make it quick because he was in a hurry. But Viva just had waited so long to marry Sam that she was just happy. She was happy to be a new bride, and she overlooked that. And the couple rented a nice apartment. They furnished it with Viva's savings because she came from a wealthy family, and she was making plans to start a family. But as months went by and Sam was around less and less, Viva was becoming suspicious. He traveled often, and although he continued to send her love letters, Viva just couldn't help but notice that he spent a lot of time with Linda Burfield, this female doctor who specialized in the fasting treatment. So Sam was frequently seen in Linda's offices downtown, and he told Viva that he planned to go into business with Linda Burfield.
Sam didn't have any medical training, right? He was just a businessman?
Yes. So in the fall of 1903, Sam introduced the two women, and he did introduce Viva as his wife. But soon after that, Viva began receiving horrible letters telling her that Linda and her husband were having a romance. And when she confronted her husband, he just kind of brushed it off. He told Viva that he and Linda just had a professional relationship. So Viva finally begged her husband to stop seeing the fasting doctor, and he agreed. He wrote a letter to Linda Burfield explaining that nothing but unhappiness could result from them having a business or personal relationship. And for the sake of his marriage, and on the advice of his father-in-law, Sam would no longer spend time with the fasting doctor. But apparently this just didn't influence Linda at all.
No, that November, under the name Samuel Hazzard, not Hargrave, Sam married Linda Burfield. So they married in her office with a friend of Linda's as a witness. But then Sam spent the next 4 nights with his other wife, Viva. I say other wife because he hadn't divorced her.
No, I mean, as far as she knows, everything's fine with them.
So he's just marrying kind.
Yeah, I guess so.
So on the 5th day after his marriage to Linda, Sam asked Viva to meet him at his office for a 4 o'clock meeting. When she arrived, Sam wasn't there, but he had left a note for her. He said that he had been detained by a business matter, but he'd see her later that evening. Except for one thing, he never came home that night, so Viva's awake all night, worrying and praying for her husband's safe return. So the next morning, Sam showed up, along with Viva's father.
Yeah, so that was weird. I'm sure that set off some alarms in her head.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, they both looked really serious, and they were just leading her to believe that they had bad news. But offering no apologies or explanation for being away overnight, Sam told Viva that she wasn't his wife. She was just a common-law wife, he explained, and there was no record of a legal marriage between the two of them. So this was quite a shock.
Wasn't it?
Yeah.
Because it had been some time that they'd been married.
Yes. And then Sam told Viva that he was actually married to Linda Burfield. So she's crushed, and her father's angry. He had really believed that Sam held some promise as a son-in-law, and as, a good husband to his daughter. He remembered how he had sent $200 to Sam to set up house for Viva and himself in Minneapolis, but Sam had just selfishly spent the money on himself. And he thought that was not a good sign, but he was giving Sam another chance. But now he wished that he had paid more attention to signs that there was a really dishonest man here, not someone his daughter should have married. But still, Sam showed no remorse for his actions, and he was moving on to bigger and better things. He was going to help start a health and treatment center with Dr. Linda Burfield, now Hazzard.
Yeah, now if Sam and Linda thought that Viva would just quietly walk away from what had been done to her, they were dead wrong. She was planning to fight for her marriage. And with her father's political weight, the Hennepin County Attorney's Office soon filed bigamy charges against Samuel C. Hargrave, a.k.a. Hazzard. The case began after Thanksgiving of that year, and it was quite a sensational story for the Minneapolis papers. Linda Hazzard went to the press and told them there was no proof of a marriage between Sam and Viva. Wasn't enough to win the case either. Linda also wanted Viva indicted for perjury. She claimed that Viva had fabricated her marriage to Sam when she was in fact living in illicit relations with Linda's husband. She claimed that Viva had deceived her parents.
Right, so the prosecution argued that there really could be no doubt Linda knew that Sam was married to Viva Hargrave when she married him. And Viva's family and the prosecutors felt that if they could not prove a wedding, it was just because the records had been deleted. Linda Hazzard was becoming powerful, and they knew that she was trying to ruin Viva so she could have validity for her own marriage to Sam. But then a woman from New York wrote letters claiming that she was Sam's first wife. She had received telegrams threatening her not to come to Minneapolis to testify against Sam, but her divorce to Sam Hazzard had not been final at the time when Sam married Viva. So he actually had...
So 3 wives now.
Yeah, so he'd done bigamy twice. Never divorced either of them.
Yeah. So in the end, it was the many letters written by Sam and Viva that convinced the court that harm had been done by Sam. His marriage to Linda was not a mistake. It was a crime against Viva.
Right, so they looked back at all these love letters that Sam had exchanged with Viva, and clearly he was lying.
Absolutely.
So it took the jury 5 hours to return the verdict of guilty, and Sam just showed no emotion. But Linda, she just went crazy. She said there was no wedding on March the 7th. Samuel was free to marry me. I am his wife. But of course the verdict said she wasn't. Sam remained calm, and Linda continued to go off about the injustice of it all. But then Viva seemed to feel sorry for Sam. So while he was responsible for what he had done, she believed he had been misled and manipulated by this evil woman, Linda Hazzard.
Now, while Sam was in jail, he was visited by both Linda and Viva. And after a few weeks of this, Sam asked Linda not to visit anymore. It was Viva who he loved and who he would return to once he got out of prison, he told Linda. When he was released in October of 1905, Sam was expected to return to Viva. She, after all, had supported him through his time in prison, sent him letters, sent him money, reading material. In Viva's opinion, Sam's wrongdoing had been the result of his weakness, and he was forgiven. But when he got out of prison, Sam immediately went to the apartments and offices of Dr. Linda Burfield. Although she had announced to the world their love affair was over, and she never wanted to see him again, she was with no one else while he was away. So obviously she hadn't given up on him.
Right. So these two just seem like they're made for each other.
Doesn't it? What a slimeball he is.
They both are. And they just really are super con artists. They're just willing to say anything to anyone and then just turn around and just brush it right off their back.
Yep. So Sam did have a lot of potential, at least on paper.
Well, and he looked great.
Yeah, good-looking guy.
He had it together, yeah.
Smart. He was even a graduate of West Point. But he didn't take responsibility for any single thing. He had a history of leaving debts behind, and he wrote bad checks to buy nice clothes or whatever else he thought he needed. And he wasn't faithful. So he cheated on his first wife, then abandoned her for another woman because she had loaned him $5,000. Then he moved on to Viva, and then he and Linda hooked up, and it just goes on and on.
Right. But even when he was with each of these women, he was having sex with other women. He just couldn't resist.
Well, of course not.
So Sam and Linda moved to Seattle, Washington in 1907, and they lived under the names Linda and Samuel Hazzard. In 1908, she self-published her book, Fasting for the Cure to Disease. The path to true health, she wrote, was to periodically let the digestive system rest through near total fasts of many, many days. And during the fast, patients were given small servings of vegetable broth, and their systems were flushed daily with enemas. They were also given vigorous massages, which nurses would later describe as being more like beatings.
Now, despite these treatments being unproven and pretty horrible to go through, Dr. Hazzard lured in many patients. Many of them were wealthy. Norwegian immigrant Daisy Maud Haglund died in 1908 after fasting for 50 days under Dr. Hazzard's supervision. And it's believed that Dr. Hazzard killed at least 14 patients, and possibly as many as 50.
Right, so this is a prolonged, miserable way to die. 50 days?
Absolutely.
Yeah, and it's not only going without food, it's these enemas, which were horrendous, and these beatings, which the nurses would describe as just terrible, bone-chilling. But in September of 1910, two of Dr. Linda Hazzard's most notable patients were staying in Victoria, British Columbia. And these are two of her patients that we're going to talk about the most because they're the ones we know the most about. And I always like to focus on particular victims so we can get a feel for who they were. So these victims were Dorothea and Claire Williamson, and they were orphan daughters of a wealthy English officer. They had been raised in wealth, attending schools in Switzerland, England, and France, and although they were well-educated and well-traveled, they did have an innocence about them that often made them the target of con artists and people just trying to get their money from them. And these two young women had been together since childhood, and neither of them had ever married. So they're both just over 30, and they didn't consider themselves old maids, which was kind of what a lot of people did back then. But I think the wealth gave them a lot of freedom that they didn't even really worry about that. They were enjoying their lives together and really didn't feel like they were missing anything.
Yeah, but as you said, they were both over 30. So yeah, they're old maids.
Yeah, but I guess in their circumstances, they weren't dependent. I mean, if you look at women who don't have any money, I mean, back then you really needed a man just to survive, right? It was hard to support yourself. So they were really fortunate to have this money and to have each other.
Yeah, they were. Dora had auburn-colored hair, and Claire had dark and wavy hair. Claire was the younger sister by just 4 years. Now, neither sister had been sleeping well, although they were tired from doing all the traveling. They had come from England, on to Quebec, then Toronto, before making their way west across to the Pacific coast. So, and as they traveled, they visited family. Their father had died a short time after Claire had been born, and their mother died when they were still teenagers. They had family left, but these were aunts, uncles, cousins, and their childhood governess, Margaret Conway.
Yeah, their Scottish-born grandfather, Charles Williamson, had left the sisters a fortune, and this was worth more than $1 million American dollars, including some land holdings in Canada, the U.S., England, and Australia. And it was really unusual for two women to control so much money in the early 1900s. I don't know what $1 million would be worth today if you change the money over, but I would think $1 million in the early 1900s was at least multi-millions.
That's a lot of money.
A lot of money, more than they would ever need.
Yes.
But at the time, there were these institutions for natural healing popping up all over the United States and Europe. And while visiting North America, the sisters visited several health institutes, and they were really into trying health fads. It had become kind of a way of life for them, searching for the secret to perfect health and a feeling of well-being. Now, they really weren't sickly at all, but they did have some minor complaints, and they just seemed to enjoy this. While traveling that fall of 1910, Claire saw an intriguing newspaper ad in a Seattle newspaper, and she responded to the ad on September 2nd of 1910. Claire wrote a letter to Dr. Linda Hazzard requesting her book, Fasting for the Cure of Disease. And in the note, she exaggerated Dora's illness. It was true that Dora, as Claire called her, had some mild aches and pains, but overall, she was fairly young and well. Claire was known to kind of embellish a bit, and Dora didn't mind, because whatever Claire wanted, Dora was pretty happy to go along with her.
So in her letter to Dr. Hazzard, Claire wrote that Dora had been on a partial fast since August 26th. She had eaten mostly fruit since then. She had swollen glands and knee pain, and she added in the letter that Dora's eyes were very bloodshot and there was some discharge.
Yeah, so just like 5 days later, a package arrived from Dr. Hazzard's office. And the sisters shared some tea in their suite as Dora read Dr. Hazzard's book aloud to Claire. Dr. Hazzard's main idea was to rest the digestive system and allow the impurities to pass out of the body. The natural cleansing process, she wrote, would strengthen the body over time. Now, like I said, Claire and Dora had been believers in natural healing, and they really didn't trust modern medicine. They were already eating a vegetarian diet, which was unusual back then, and they rejected corsets, which were really popular still. As they went through Dr. Hazzard's book, they talked about undergoing her treatment. The treatment could really be their answer for a lifetime of good health, they thought. A brochure tucked into the book described Hazzard's Institute of Natural Therapeutics that was located in the country outside of Seattle, and the address was in the village of Olalla, across from Puget Sound. It sounded like a paradise of tall trees, salt water, fresh air, just a great place to get well and get some rest. Kind of a vacation, really.
A spa.
Yeah, right. That's what we call it nowadays.
You know, these sisters, obviously they had a lot of time on their hands and pretty close to unlimited funds. Treatment was a medical necessity, but also a reason for the vacation. Dora believed that she had swollen glands and acute rheumatic pains in her knees. In support of Claire's misconception that she also was in need of treatment, a London osteopath had told her that her uterus had dropped back on her spine and she had inflamed ovaries. Now, before receiving that diagnosis, Claire had believed that she had a sensitive stomach.
So none of these sound like earth-shattering things.
No. None of them are.
No. So although they did consider several different treatment centers, they read that Dr. Hazzard was the only licensed fasting specialist in the world, whatever that meant.
It means nothing.
Yeah.
That's okay.
True. So Dr. Hazzard claimed that she alone had discovered the cure for all ailments, mental, physical, even moral, which I don't know how that works. But she wrote that overeating is the vice of the whole human race. So she was a fattist.
She was.
A fattist with a D and a fattist with a T.
Yeah. So therapy in the country sounded like the right thing for Claire and Dora. So after visiting North America, they did have plans to go back to Australia and London, both places where they had family homes. Claire planned to leave for London on May 18, 1911. She had signed up for a kindergarten teaching course. And while Claire was in London, Dora planned to visit an aunt in Australia. Dora knew she couldn't stay with Claire during the training, and she preferred not to spend any huge length of time alone. So in September of 1910, they made their plans. They would not tell any of their relatives about the Institute because they tended to judge them for following the latest health fads. So they've obviously been ridiculed a little bit before.
Yeah, sounds like it.
So under the advice of an osteopathic physician they had seen while in Victoria, they decided to spend the winter in California and then see Dr. Hazzard the following spring, when the weather in the Northwest would be warmer. Claire wrote a letter telling the doctor that Dora was not well enough to make the trip to Seattle yet. She needed sunshine and rest. Before signing off, she told the doctor that Dora had been taking nightly enemas and her health had improved, but she wasn't yet well enough for a trip to Seattle.
Which wasn't really true. They just didn't want to go there until it was warmer.
Right.
Yeah, so it's more like a fun trip for them. It's kind of like Comic-Con, HealthCon, that type of deal.
It sounds like it. I mean, it doesn't sound like they're that serious
No.
about it. You know, it's kind of like, oh, this sounds like a lark. Let's try it.
Right. Well, because they'd done other things and it never really caused any harm before. And Claire had never had a serious illness, but she did believe that since childhood she'd had a delicate constitution. But a cousin once told others in the family, being rich is the cause of all their problems. Claire and Dora are ill because they can afford to be ill. And that seems like a wise cousin.
Yeah, but I bet he went unheeded.
Sure.
So Dr. Hazzard responded to Claire in a letter, December of 1910. She told her that the sanitarium wasn't ready yet, but it would be open for patients in just a few weeks. She instructed both sisters to keep using their enemas and to consume a diet of vegetable broth and cornbread only. And then in closing, she assured them both that they would have excellent results once they were at her sanitarium in Olalla.
Right. So they didn't really stick to that diet. They didn't really lose weight before they went. And one of the reasons was, they were traveling in with family. They had all these great foods being put in front of them constantly. But as they planned their travels, they did agree that when they took Dr. Hazzard's treatment, they were going to follow it to the T, and they weren't going to tell anyone they were there. They wanted to be in Seattle by March 1st, and in mid-April, Dora planned to sail to Australia, while Claire went to England for her class. So on January 14th of 1911, the girls sent another letter to Dr. Hazzard, and Dora was feeling great, she said. Claire and she were following the cornbread and broth diet. Dr. Hazzard wrote back that the sanitarium was still not ready for patients, but then she said it was possible for a transfer to be made to Olalla after starting their treatment in Seattle. So what she said she'd do is she'd charge $60 per patient per month, and more would be charged if extra consultation was needed, and arrangements were made for the sisters to stay in a furnished apartment that was near Dr. Hazzard's offices. And then the idea is they can move to the country soon after.
So on February 27th, 1911, the Williamson sisters were in Dr. Hazzard's office, which was located in the Northern Bank and Trust building. Claire and Dora Williamson were impressed with the way the doctor carried herself. She just had that confidence. She wore a white dress that looked like a nurse's uniform and shook the sisters' hands in a rough, firm gesture that they just weren't used to having done to them.
No, anything I've read about this woman is she was intimidating. And she even ran Sam around. She was in charge.
She was.
So she was first a nurse, she said, and since 1898 she had been an osteopath. She gave the women a brochure which promoted this revolutionary treatment. The list of things the treatment could cure was very long, which should have given them a clue that this was just all too good to be true, but it didn't. And Dr. Hazzard claimed that she had cured cancer, toothaches, psoriasis, heart trouble, tuberculosis, epilepsy, even insanity. The list went on and on. But she had no scientific backing. All she had were some testimonials from former patients.
Yeah, those are always worthwhile.
Well, I think they work on a lot of people, though. Even now. If you have someone say, I went here and I was cured, a lot of people believe it.
Yeah, I think this day and age, you still want a little more proof. But yeah, you're right. People are always making claims.
Absolutely. So one case that Dr. Hazzard shared with the sisters was this case of Mrs. J.B. Barnett. This was a 65-year-old woman from Kansas City, Missouri, and Miss Barnett had never been well. She'd suffered from chronic constipation and aggravated bilious attacks since childhood. Until she had Dr. Hazzard's fasting treatment, she also had debilitating melancholia, resulting in mild suicidal tendencies. Now, I know the word melancholy, but I've never heard that before. Melancholia.
Yeah, that's the name for depression.
Okay.
100 years ago.
But according to Dr. Hazzard, on the second week of her fast, Mrs. Barnett's mental state improved greatly. And by the third week, she was writing a long, cheerful note to her daughter, something she hadn't done in years. On the 43rd day, Dr. Hazzard said, hunger manifested itself, and Mrs. Barnett's tongue showed clean on the 44th day. So this was a term that Hazzard used, showed clean. So once people started fasting, they would show her their tongue, and when the fast could end was when she declared that the tongue was clean.
Clean as in uncoated.
I don't know. I mean, you can uncoat it by brushing it, right? So
Sure.
I don't know. It just seems like gobbledygook, really. But anyway, she said that they waited until the morning of the 46th day, so 3 more days, and started back with some bean broth. And when Mrs. Barnett left Seattle, she'd completely recovered, both mentally and physically. So she's telling him a story of success.
Yeah. Now, if the sisters thought that it was odd that the doctor did no physical exams and asked no questions about their health, they didn't say so. Now, since the sanitarium in Olalla still wasn't ready, the sisters were put up in an apartment in Seattle. And then in the next few days, the sisters heard more about Dr. Hazzard's miracle treatment. She told them about a boy she had treated in 1905 named Edward Anderson. Edward was just 17 when a doctor told his mother that there was no hope. He was dying. His mother contacted the fasting specialist, and she found the boy suffering from inflammatory rheumatism. He had been bedridden for 5 weeks, and his left arm, wrist, and hand were swollen. His ankles and other joints were inflamed. His face was flushed, and his breathing was labored. So Edward was immediately put on a fast. Dr. Hazzard massaged the boy and gave him internal baths, that is, enemas, to eliminate toxic matter from the lower bowel. Amazingly, within an hour he was better. And as he got stronger, the amount of food he was given was slowly increased. Edward was a miracle, because he'd been told he was going to die.
Yes.
And his savior was Dr. Hazzard. She had saved him from certain death.
So this impressed the sisters.
Well, yeah, I mean, this kid is near death. She brought him back.
So, even though the sanitarium wasn't ready for them yet, they were thrilled to have the fasting specialist caring for them. They visited the doctor's office 5 days a week for consults, and their apartment was a lot less fancy than they were used to, but it was clean and adequate. And every day they asked each other if that would be the day when they would be cured, because they knew it was just a matter of time and they were going to feel great.
Well, they're listening to Dr. Hazzard.
And they're really convinced by her.
Things are going to be great.
So in the beginning, Dora was just going along with the treatment to please her sister, but then as time passed, she too became convinced that this treatment was going to work. I mean, it's really all they had time to think about and do. There was nothing else to do there. And it was almost as if the doctor had hypnotized them. So Dr. Hazzard's treatment was referred to as the beautiful treatment, and she promised both of the sisters perfect health if they just followed the fast. But from early on at the Seattle apartment, both sisters started fainting daily. It became so common that no one seemed to think it was a big deal. Dora heard Claire fall in the kitchen, but she was too weak and lightheaded to get up and go to her. So people did come to the apartment, but it was no one who the sisters knew before. These were people who were sent over by Dr. Hazzard. One young nurse named Sarah Robinson cared for them for a while, but as soon as she could, she came up with an excuse and left for another job. Another visitor to the sisters was a friend of the doctor. This was a young, friendly guy named James Watson Webb, and James would come by with books on spiritualism. And as the sisters drifted in and out of consciousness, he would just read passages aloud to them.
So what's happening with these two is they're getting more dehydrated. They're not eating, they're fasting, but they're getting some fluids. But they're also getting the enemas. So their net is, besides losing weight from lack of calories, they're losing water because they're taking in less water than they're giving out.
So it didn't take long for them to feel weak.
No.
So they began sleeping away most of their days, and walking finally became really hard for them without fainting. They were actually given enemas of 6 quarts of warm water as they curled up in the fetal position in the bathtub. And at the beginning of the fast, the enemas only took about a half an hour, but then as days passed, the length of time increased. and became this horrible experience that would last 3 to 4 hours, sometimes longer. After Dora fainted in the middle of one of her enemas, canvas material was stretched over the edges of the tub like a hammock to support her. When Claire did dare to complain, Dr. Hazzard insisted that without the internal bath, they would not achieve their desired results. So even though this Dr. Hazzard was only about 10 years older than the sisters, she seemed to just have this amazing authority over them. They would do whatever she said, basically.
Well, she had promised them, right?
Right, but there's also this thing about doctors where people kind of think they know everything. Some people, and they'll do whatever they're told. I mean, that does exist.
Yeah, well, and you're also getting to the point where they're weak enough that they can't really resist or do anything.
Yeah, I think that was the plan and the technique, to just keep weakening them. And then you can start taking over things more and more as they can't really speak up for themselves.
Right. So the apartment walls weren't soundproof, and neighbors could hear disturbing noises coming from the Williamson sisters' apartment. They sounded like they were in real pain and distress. And then whenever they saw the sisters, they were just totally shocked by their appearance. They had these dark lines around their mouths. Their eyes were sunken into their head. Their hands were so bony that they looked just like thin skin over the knuckles and hand bones. Claire's smile disturbed the neighbors because her lips were so thin they no longer covered her teeth, so she's walking around with a permanent grimace on her face.
Isn't that horrific? I mean, at this point, the sisters couldn't even make it to the doctor's office, and she was coming to the apartment to do what she called her osteopathic manipulations. But according to the nurses who saw these, the doctor would slam her fists on the girls' thighs, stomachs, backs, even their heads. And she beat on their torsos, which had less muscle and fat on them as time went by and they got thinner and thinner. So these girls became pretty helpless pretty quickly.
They sure did.
So when one nurse, Clara Corrigan, said to the doctor that the treatment seemed harsh, she just said nonsense. It helps the circulation. Clara heard the doctor talking to an older nurse about a patient who had died at the Olalla sanitarium, and she talked about how she had done the autopsy herself and complained that she didn't have a large enough container to hold the remains. And the nurse heard Dr. Hazzard say that she would need to get a larger kettle for the remains. And this was quite shocking to the nurse, as you can imagine. Right?
No kidding.
So Clara, the nurse, told a friend about the Williamson sisters' shocking condition. She said their skin was so tight over their abdomens that it was as hard as like a wooden chair. And she would try and get the sisters to take more broth or fruit juice, but they insisted that they needed to follow Dr. Hazzard's instructions so they could have perfect health. Dory was given a teaspoon of orange juice every hour, and then each sister was given tomato or asparagus broth twice a day. And the whole idea was that these were pure and they were grown there, but nothing was grown there. The vegetables that they boiled and made broth from were from cans. But, the sisters have no idea. At this point, they're pretty totally dependent. They need nurses to bathe them and even to help them walk from their bed to a chair.
Yeah, they're just getting weaker and weaker.
Yes, it's just horrific.
Now, a neighbor told one of the nurses that she had never heard the sisters use the kitchen, and the nurse explained that they would not eat. By mid-March, Dr. Hazzard was starting to ask the sisters about their finances. She would ask some questions such as who was in charge of the finances and who managed the money and stuff. When they told her that they took care of their own finances, the doctor told them that they shouldn't be thinking about or talking about money, as it would negatively affect their treatment.
So that's not even subtle. But they had total trust in her, it seems. And after about 2 months in the Seattle apartment, Dr. Hazzard told the sisters that she wanted to store their valuables for them. She said she had a safe in her office. And I guess they totally trusted her because they agreed. Dr. Hazzard also took their land deeds, their cash, and she even removed some of the rings from their fingers. Because, they're so thin now, the rings will just fall off.
Yeah, they're going to fall off anyway.
Yeah. So it was Claire who lost the most weight and appeared to be the weaker of the two sisters. But then Dora started showing signs of mental weakness and confusion. Her mind began to wander in confusion, and she just drifted in and out of being conscious. And that would be the dehydration?
Absolutely. By later April, Claire and Dora were put on stretchers to be taken to the Olalla sanitarium by ambulance. So the sanitarium is up and running. Actually had been, but they were in Seattle. So they waited in two separate ambulances, wrapped in blankets because they were always cold. And while they were waiting, Dr. Hazzard brought her attorney, John Arthur, to Claire. He was preparing a codicil to her will. At the attorney's direction, Claire wrote a letter to her longtime nurse and friend, Margaret Conway, in Brunswick, Victoria, Australia.
Yeah, so the sisters were carried into the Hazzard home through the back door. And on the right side of the house, there was Sam and Linda's room, and inside of that, there was a little bathroom. They went down a hallway where there was a narrow staircase leading to an unfinished attic. And at one end was Claire's room, which was just a small sleeping area with a window. And then there was a wooden divider set up outside the landing, and that's where Dora's bed was set up. So they're paying to go to this country spa type of deal.
Jeez.
And she's just putting them up in her attic.
Yep.
But, at this point, they're too weak to argue or really say anything. Plus, Dr. Hazzard always had an answer, it seems.
Yeah, well, they were still following her right along.
Yeah.
So the day after the sisters got to Olalla, Sam showed up at Claire's bedside. He said his wife thought it was a good idea for him to come and assist them with any correspondence that they needed to have done. Dora was still out of it, but Claire was strong enough and trusting enough to see his visit as a genuine offer of help. And once they were settled in Olalla, Dr. Hazzard insisted that Claire and Dora were to be kept apart. The nurses were told that the sisters needed to focus all their attention on their treatments. If they did speak to one another, they would be distracted, and distraction could impede their recovery.
So she already seems to have kind of an MO here, like she's done it before. I mean,
Absolutely.
It seems like there's a real plan here, right? She's just taking more and more control, moving them up into an attic where there are no neighbors like there were at the apartment building, right?
Right.
So there's really no witnesses. And then not even letting them be with each other. So it's much easier to brainwash someone when they have no contact with anyone but you, and you're the one telling them everything.
Oh, yeah. It's like you're in solitary confinement.
Right. And Dora was told that Claire was too weak to see any visitors, including her. At the same time, Claire was told that Dora had become completely insane. So this terrified Claire. Dr. Hazzard said that once the poisons left Dora's body, her mind could heal, but of course neither sister knew what had been told to the other one, so she's playing a game here. Then one afternoon, when the house seemed quiet, Dora did push herself onto the floor and crawl to Claire's bed. And she would say that Claire looked like a skeleton, and she was just shocked. But Claire was just terrified when she saw Dora and told her she had to leave because they'd be in trouble if they were seen together. So it's just ridiculous. They seem to have given over all their power to this woman.
Yeah, I mean, it's still, to me, when I read through this, it's amazing that they got to this point without starting to get suspicious. But I guess they just believed so thoroughly in Dr. Hazzard that they weren't going to question anything.
I don't know. It's kind of cult-like, really.
It is.
Isn't it? Like she thinks she's the all-powerful one, and her patients seem to believe it too.
She did. So Margaret Conway, this is the woman who is the governess, nanny, whatever you want to call her, for the two sisters. She was in Melbourne with her sisters when she received the letter written by Claire. Now, Margaret had never married. She had been hired by the Williamson family to care for Dora when she was a 1-year-old. Just before she arrived in England, Dora's younger sister Gertrude was born. Gertrude was sickly from the beginning, and at age 3, she died from scarlet fever. Then Claire was born shortly thereafter. Their father died while Claire was still a baby, and then, as you said, their mother died when they were teens. And when that happened, Claire was afraid of most everything. With time, she outgrew her shyness, and she had Margaret to thank for it. Because of the death of their parents, Margaret was more important in Claire and Dora's lives than she would have been otherwise.
Yeah, I mean, she really was like a mother to these sisters.
She was.
I mean, from early childhood, they had a little nickname for her. They called her Tootie.
That's sweet.
Yeah. So that winter, letters came to Margaret in Australia from Claire and Dora. And they wrote to her about their relatives in California and that they planned to return to British Columbia for a short time and then sail for England and Australia. But they didn't say anything to Margaret about Seattle or Olalla or Dr. Linda Hazzard. Nothing. They're keeping that a secret from everyone. But then on April 30th, 1911, a cablegram arrived for Margaret. And it read, "Come SS Marama, May 8th, First Class, Claire." So it's just a few words, and Margaret didn't make much of it at first, but the more she thought it over, she realized it was really an odd request from Claire. So 1 week later, she took the Union Steamship Company's SS Marama to go to Claire and Dora. And the more she thought about the cable, the more certain she was that the girls needed her. You know, she called them the girls. They were really like her own children to her. So she felt like they needed her help. So that's a strong feeling to get from just a sentence or two.
It sure is. But, she essentially raised them.
Yeah, so she knew.
Yeah.
She knew them so well. Margaret had to stop in Hawaii on her trip, and on May 23rd, she received a letter that had been written by Claire that was dated May 2nd. So about 3 weeks.
3 weeks.
Yeah. So the return address was in the care of a person Margaret had never heard of before, and that was Linda Hazzard, Olalla, Kitsap County, Washington, USA. The letter was Claire's handwriting, but it was much less neat than usual, and her sentences seemed to run together. Margaret was beginning to freak out a bit after that, because Claire was an educated young woman who knew how to write a hell of a letter. But this letter that just didn't seem quite right went on for an entire page, and in it Claire wrote about Linda and Sam Hazzard and what remarkable people they were. She told Margaret about the fasting treatment, too, at this point. And Margaret had never heard of this before, but she was kind of used to the sisters seeking out these health fads.
Yeah, the letter mentioned that the Hazzards were building cabins for them at Olalla. They were going to have front porches where they could sleep outside in the fresh night air. Claire asked Margaret to keep an open mind about the local people and their views.
So after arriving in Vancouver, Margaret was met by Sam Hazzard. Sam said he had reserved 2 rooms at a nearby hotel, and after they slept for the night, he would ride with her on the 4-hour boat trip to Seattle. Then once in Seattle, they'd take a launch to Olalla. Sam seemed like a real gentleman to Margaret, but then he told her that Claire was dead and Dora was insane. And he said it just very matter of fact. So Margaret was shocked, of course. She took the boat and the launch to Olalla with him the next day, but he hardly said anything to her. He didn't express any sympathy or concern. It's just like any other day, so he was definitely a cold man.
He certainly was. Well, he's married to Linda.
True story.
So once they arrived in Olalla, Margaret met Linda. She was definitely an abrasive woman, and she explained that the sisters had come to her either for a cure or to die. But she said they were too far gone to be saved by her treatment. She explained that Claire's organs had been dried out and hardened. She also explained that she had done the autopsy and she had embalmed Claire's body. But when Margaret saw the body, it didn't look like Claire. In fact, it was a different person. Claire had been so skeletal that Linda Hazzard didn't want anyone to see the condition of her body. But she insisted that this embalmed body was Claire.
Right, and what's Margaret going to say? She's kind of been a servant all her life, and this woman is very intimidating. And plus, she's heartbroken. It's like her daughter she's lost. She's devastated.
Yeah.
Now, the one thing she couldn't believe that they had told her also was that Dora was insane. Dora had never shown any problems mentally. When she was finally allowed to go out to Dora's cabin at Olalla, she couldn't believe how Dora looked. Now, Dora and Claire had been moved out to little cabins on the property, which were really pretty dumpy. And these are wealthy women who are paying a lot of money. But, that's the least of the problems here. because Dora was just skin and bones, and her skin just had a bluish hue, and her voice was also very hoarse and weak. And much of that beautiful thick auburn hair she'd had fallen out, so she just looked like hell.
Now, at first Dora begged Margaret to take her away, but she was still somewhat under the power of Dr. Hazzard, so she was afraid to go against her. And she was in deep grief over Claire's death. Claire had been her last living immediate family member, and the two were extremely close. Now, Margaret had always followed the plans of the wealthy people she served, but in this case she made a quick decision that she would have to make decisions for Dora to save her life.
Yeah, that's a really kind of a fun part of this story is Margaret Conway and how she became so much more confident and assertive because she had to deal with this. It made her a stronger person, which I find interesting because she was definitely in a repressed situation.
Well, yeah. Early 1900s?
Yeah, it wasn't good.
Not for women.
No, not at all. So Dora and Claire's uncle, John Herbert, received a cable from Dr. Hazzard on May 22nd with this really harsh message. Your niece, Claire Williamson, is dead. Would you like to come to Seattle and attend the funeral on Thursday? Dora is with me. Now, you have to remember here, the last John heard from his nieces was just a couple months ago in March, and everything had sounded fine. He'd believed that Claire and Dora were supposed to be traveling to Europe and Australia, and he had no idea why they'd gone to Seattle. So John went there, and when he met Linda Hazzard, she told him that Claire had died on May 21st, and she showed him the same body that she would show Margaret. So he too didn't believe it was Claire. But she told him that Claire had died of cirrhosis of the liver, and she even showed him some small dried out organs that she claimed were Claire's, because she did autopsies on site there. And he was disgusted. She had these organs wrapped in an old cloth inside her office.
Oh, yuck.
And of course, he really didn't have any medical knowledge, but these were just, it was ridiculous. These dried out, hardened organs, so-called. Who knows what it was?
Yeah, whatever.
Yeah.
So concerning Dora, Linda Hazzard told John that she was insane and was beyond being saved. She took him to see her, and he was both shocked and heartbroken by her condition. Dora and John were told that Dora was in no condition to travel, and that Dora had decided to live out the rest of her life in Olalla. Then both sisters would be cremated and their ashes buried there.
So is this crazy?
Yeah.
I mean, these are two young, healthy women, and she's acting like this was a hospice or something.
Yep.
So Sam and Linda led John Herbert into the dining room, where Sam showed him a document, and this was 2 sheets of paper, and Sam told him that Claire had written it. It was addressed to her relations and friends, and it was dated back on April 23rd. Sam explained that the first part had been written by Claire, but then she had become too tired to continue drafting it by herself, so she hadn't signed it. And he explained that Claire had dictated part of it to him, and then he promised he would look for the original, which he claimed had been signed by Claire. So, very vague, weird stories going on here. And John Herbert wasn't an idiot. He was actually a businessman, so he knew a little something about documents.
Yes.
And this document basically cleared the doctor of any responsibility and claimed that all of their financials were handled because Claire knew of her death a week before she died. And Sam told John Herbert that John Arthur in Seattle was a good friend to the sisters, and he was their attorney who was handling everything.
Yeah, so before Herbert left for his home in Portland, Oregon, he stopped at the attorney's office. The attorney was friendly with Herbert and said that he was handling all their affairs. The whole situation was just so shocking to John Herbert. He also believed that Dora was quite lucid and not insane. She was just heartbroken over her sister's death, and she was obviously physically unwell.
Right, but one thing I don't understand is why he left.
Right, I don't know.
I mean, was he just believing everything he was told, and I guess Dora told him that she wanted to be there? I don't know, I just can't imagine leaving her in that situation.
Yeah, but he did.
So when Dora's assigned nurse left Olalla in June, Margaret Conway insisted that she was going to take over Dora's care. And Dr. Hazzard did reluctantly agree. Dora was only allowed 2 meals a day of broth, water, and a tiny serving of mashed vegetables. Margaret tried to get her to eat more than the 2 meals, but Dora refused. The idea that she must not eat more than these 2 meals a day just seemed ingrained in her by Dr. Hazzard. And the doctor had talked about it so much that she just seemed to accept it as true. Margaret had tried to add cream or butter into Dora's broths to give her some more calories, but at this point her stomach couldn't handle it, and she would vomit it up.
And then when she got inside the main house, she found documents that Dora had given power of attorney to Sam Hazzard. She stuck it in her pocket and took it to Dora. And Dora said, "I don't know what that is."
Yeah, Dora remembered that Sam Hazzard had told her that she was too ill to draw checks herself, and that if she gave him power of attorney, he could handle anything she wanted done. So she had been far too trusting, even though, of course, she was misled. Dora and Margaret soon found more paperwork showing that the Hazzards had taken hundreds of dollars from Dora's accounts without her consent. So Dora and Margaret wrote letters to the bank, but for some reason they never heard back from the bank. And it turned out that the Hazzards weren't mailing Dora's letters, and they'd had the mailbox at Olalla locked so that Margaret couldn't collect the mail. So during her stay, Margaret also saw Linda Hazzard and some other staff wearing Claire's clothing. So that's really creepy.
Yeah, Dora recalled to Margaret that a couple days after Claire's death, Linda Hazzard had opened up her trunks. The tiny bed where Claire had died was covered with her gowns and dresses and other personal items. So Dora could hear noise and laughter coming from the attic room, but she didn't know what was going on until Dr. Hazzard showed up. Hazzard tried on evening dresses and showed herself to Dora in her dead sister's clothing. And whatever things she didn't want, Hazzard gave to some of the staff.
It's just amazing.
This is just getting worse and worse, isn't it?
Yeah. But one day, fortunately, Margaret ran into the mail carrier and asked if there was anything for Dora or her. And she was surprised to be given 2 envelopes because they hadn't gotten any mail in weeks. And the day she happens to ask, they have 2 letters. So a former nurse of Dora and Claire returned to Olalla to warn Margaret that Dora needed to leave or soon she'd be dead too. And this was Sarah Robinson, the young nurse who had left earlier. The only reason she returned was because she was worried about Dora, and her conscience had really gotten to her. So she pulled Margaret aside to talk to her, and she told her about something that had happened in the spring of 1910, and this was when the doctor called her to assist in the care of another patient. It was the case of a man named Erdman, and he had starved to death. Earl Edward Erdman had been a civil engineer who came to Seattle after working on a project on the Columbia River. He had complaints of indigestion, and after seeing multiple doctors, he hadn't gotten any relief, so he decided to try Dr. Hazzard, and he went to see her at her downtown office. After 3 weeks without food, getting the daily enemas and being massaged by the fasting specialist, this 24-year-old man was just wasted away. A friend ordered an ambulance to take him to the city hospital, but doctors there decided the only way to possibly save him would be a blood transfusion. But he died before he could get the transfusion. But Sarah had been one of his nurses, and she said she'd never forget it. She could count his ribs. His eyes were sunken so much that he looked like an old man. And she didn't want the same thing to happen to Dora.
Now, on March 29th, 1910, the Seattle Daily Times headline was, "Woman MD," the MD's in parentheses, "kills another patient."
Yeah, and I think the only way that Earl Erdman got into the paper was because he had been transferred to a hospital.
Yeah.
I mean, if he died on her land, people probably really wouldn't have known.
But still, there wasn't anything done. The county coroner claimed that he was powerless to intervene. He called it one of many cases which came up frequently and highlighted the need for more stringent laws in regard to so-called doctors.
True words.
True words.
I don't know how powerless he was, though.
He chose to be powerless.
Well, on the day after that, she was back in the newspaper because she was immediately vindicated, and the headline was, "Dr. Hazzard Gets License." So coincidentally, the day after Earl Erdman died, the State Board of Medical Examiners announced that the fasting specialist was legally entitled to practice. 28 others were also granted medical licenses, and these doctors practiced hot air therapy, mechanotherapy, and electrotherapeutics. Have you ever heard of those? Are those things?
Well, I guess they're things, but they're not therapeutic things.
No, so there was just a whole rise of quacks because there was nothing being done.
Well, this is just a continuation of the state of affairs.
Right.
So it's not all of a sudden it happened. It's how it was. Things have changed, obviously, since then.
Yeah. So Margaret was unable to convince Dr. Hazzard to let her take Dora away. And finally she snuck off and sent a cable to Dora's uncle, John Herbert. And then in July, the uncle traveled back to Olalla. And the Hazzards told him they weren't going to release Dora to him. They insisted that she had signed over her care to them. Finally, he was able to convince the Hazzards to release his niece, and the only way to save her from them was to pay them a lot of money. And Linda Hazzard said this was her normal charge for services rendered. She said she was a healer and she could charge whatever she wanted. So Linda Hazzard had given Claire's diary to Margaret Conway, but before she left with John Herbert and Dora, she was asking for the diary back. Margaret pretended not to know where it was, but she was keeping it because she thought there must be something in there that the doctor is worried about. And in the diary, there was something. She read this suspicious entry from Friday, May 19th. That would be right before Claire had died. So the entry praised Linda Hazzard, but the sentence that really caught Margaret's attention was this: "My diamonds shall go to Dr. Hazzard that Claire gave to me, and at my death shall go to Dora, if she is alive." So the wording in the sentence suggested that Claire hadn't written the entry at all. She wouldn't call herself Claire, right?
No,
Plus,
she wouldn't.
The handwriting didn't look like hers. And plus, it's already laying the groundwork for Dora being dead.
It sure is. If she is alive, right?
Yeah, you don't usually say that about someone in their 30s.
No. So Dora was carried away from Dr. Hazzard's sanitarium on the morning of July 22nd. It had been 52 days since Margaret's arrival at Olalla. Dora had spent nearly 100 days at the sanitarium. And as she was loaded onto the lawn to Seattle, people looked at her in horror. And that's when they first heard the locals' nickname for Dr. Hazzard's place, Starvation Heights.
Yeah, so one of the amazing and upsetting things about this whole story is that people knew. The locals had actually grown used to the starving people, most of them women, at Starvation Heights, which I guess was originally Wilderness Heights. But women were seen crawling to the road into town like skeletons, begging for food or a ride into town. And they really looked like pictures of people in Nazi concentration camps. Margaret remembered that if she pressed on Dora's abdomen, she could feel her vertebrae, her backbones. So when she finally left, Dora weighed 50 pounds. Just amazing that she was even alive.
Sure is. 50 pounds, less than half of her typical weight.
Yeah, she started out at about 110 pounds, which is already slender.
Yeah.
So just horrific.
So working with a nearby British vice consul, Lucien Agassiz, John Herbert was able to find Linda Hazzard's connection to the deaths of other people. He learned that she had actually been starving people and stealing their money for years. They had even taken the gold fillings from the corpses and sold them to a local dentist. God, this is just getting more and more gruesome.
Yeah, I mean, it's really greed. The greed knows no bounds. It's just amazing.
So there was also the case of Eugene Stanley Wakelin. He died from a gunshot to the head when he was on the Hazzard's property in 1909. It's not known if Linda Hazzard was the one who shot and killed him. He had come from New Zealand to take the fast cure, and he allegedly shot himself. Now, one suspicious part of his story is that they didn't find his decomposed body for 3 weeks after his death, And this was despite Dr. Hazzard doing daily treatments on him. So something's not right there.
That's a big chink in the chain.
It is.
I think that's more than just something suspicious. I think that's evidence.
Yes, it is.
So Margaret Conway had changed into this much more assertive person since being around Dr. Hazzard. So she firmly told Agassiz that Dr. Hazzard had imprisoned the sisters and stolen their money. She had also forged and cashed their personal checks. She had taken their jewelry, much of it family heirlooms. Her guardianship over Dora was another crime. She had gained control of the sisters' money and taken just as much as she could. So if Margaret or their Uncle John had not shown up, Dora would definitely have been dead too. There's no doubt. I mean, if no one had showed up for the sisters, they would have just died, all their money would be gone, and nobody would know any better.
That's right. So an arrest warrant was obtained, and Linda Burfield Hazzard was charged with the willful murder of British heiress Claire Williamson. The complaint stated that Claire had been intentionally starved to death. Then on August 15th, Dr. Hazzard was arrested, and the trial began the following January. Nurses and other staff testified about the starvation of the sisters, the hours-long enemas, and the painful massages. The prosecution called the financial crimes financial starvation, and the evidence for that included letters, fraudulent documents, and forged checks. There were insinuations that the Butterfield mortuary was working with the Hazzards, and that they had switched Claire's body with a healthier-looking body so no one would know how skeletal Claire was when she died. So in her book, Fasting for the Cure for Disease, Hazzard wrote, "Death in the fast never results from the deprivation of food, but it is the inevitable consequence of vitality sapped to the last degree by organic imperfection." In other words, if a patient died during the fast, they already had something that was going to kill them anyway. That's a win-win situation, right?
For her it is, right?
Yeah.
But just like many quacks who are still around today, Linda said that she was persecuted by conventional medicine for using her more natural methods. And there were others in the natural health field who supported her. Henry S. Tanner, a doctor who had fasted publicly for 40 days in 1880, offered to testify for Dr. Hazzard. But the jury in Hazzard's trial wasn't buying into her claims of being persecuted, and they returned with a verdict of guilty of manslaughter, and she was sentenced to 2 to 20 years of hard labor, and her medical license was revoked. But it's just infuriating that she served only 2 years.
2 years.
And why was it even manslaughter? Why wasn't it murder?
I don't know.
Seems like she got away with a hell of a lot.
Didn't she?
Yes. And it gets worse. 6 months after she returned to Seattle, the governor granted her a pardon with the condition that she leave America. So she moved to New Zealand, where she had a lot of supporters, and over the next several years, she lived in Auckland and had 2 suites of offices in New Zealand insurance buildings. And business was really good for her in New Zealand. She even had another book published, Diet in Disease and Systemic Cleansing. Then in 1920, she was allowed to return to Olalla, and what they did was they rebuilt, and she called her business a school for health, which I guess was some kind of loophole because she didn't have a medical license anymore. But in New Zealand, she and Sam had been so financially successful that they were able to resume ownership of Starvation Heights and even build the sanitarium of her dreams. So even though she wasn't allowed to practice medicine, she was still identifying herself as a physician and still doing the same kind of stuff.
She was. I don't know why people weren't keeping an eye on this.
Good question.
So Linda and Sam Hazzard became involved with the Olalla School, and they awarded academic scholarships. And they were respected for that, even despite one of their scholarship checks bouncing. No expense was spared on the sanitarium. It became famous locally, and out-of-towners visited it. And at the time it seemed that no one had anything bad to say about Dr. Hazzard. But she never did become a law-abiding citizen. In April 1922, she took over the care of a patient in Los Angeles, and she was arrested for violating California's Medical Practice Act, that is, practicing medicine without a license. Then 3 years later, she was arrested again for the same thing in connection with the death of a man named Leonard Ritter. Ritter had sold his farm to pay for treatment at the School of Health, and after an 84-day fast, his weight went from 168 pounds to 100 pounds, and he died. So for this, she was convicted, received no jail sentence, and was fined $100. You gotta be kidding me.
I know, right? And this is years later, after she had killed Claire.
Yeah.
So the Hazzards were continuing to supervise fasts in Olalla all the way until 1935. 3 years after that, Linda Hazzard gave herself the fasting treatment for some illness she had, and she died. So a lot of people have said maybe that's justice, but it really isn't.
It's kind of karma, isn't it?
It's a little karma, but it's certainly not enough. She still got away for years with these things.
Repeatedly.
Yeah.
Holy cow.
Obviously no respect for human life, right? And incredible hubris and incredible greed.
Yes to all those.
Yeah. It's really difficult for me to understand how her patients continued to believe in her, even as they were dying from this treatment. Very cult-like. Really a strange power over these people. But, there are still quacks out there. It's not as bad now, but there are plenty of people who will believe in false, unscientific claims. And one example is people who have incurable illnesses like cancers and resort to some so-called natural methods. It's a bit easier to understand if it's someone who's tried everything and there's no hope and they're just desperate for a cure or something to just extend their lives. It's a little more difficult to understand people like the Williamson sisters, who were just kind of there on a lark, really, but really bought into it. And there are some people who still believe in fasting, and there are these breatharians who think they can survive on air and sunlight.
Yeah, good luck with that.
But there are some valid studies of an intermittent fasting or taking fewer calories can give you better health and weight loss. But that's totally different.
That is. We're not talking about no caloric intake, anything like that. And there are a host of studies that show reducing calorie intake and achieving weight loss without significant weight loss can be beneficial.
Well, and that's what we all want, but it's so hard not to eat.
Well, yeah.
It is.
Now, there are still people, quacks, for want of a better word, that are getting away with taking advantage of desperate or naive people. And there's one example, that's the Brzezinski case.
Yeah, that is a big example. That's a really unbelievable thing.
Yeah, he's been involved in cancer quackery since the 1970s. This guy left Baylor University to set up his own private practice and manufacturing facility, where he makes and administers his ANPs, which he calls anti-neoplastins. This is anti-cancer drugs. They turned out to be mostly modified amino acids and peptides.
So they really did nothing.
No, they're not going to hurt anything, but they're not going to do anything.
What they do hurt is some people put off real treatment to do that.
Oh, sure.
And then it really does cause a lot of harm.
Yeah, and not only that, he wasn't doing this for altruistic reasons. He was charging huge amounts of money, charging desperate cancer patients, a lot of people with terminal cancers, and he's just soaking them down.
Yeah, the Texas Medical Board and the FDA have been trying to shut him down for years, but they've only had some small temporary successes. There's been a lot written about him, and it's fascinating, but also infuriating. But it's definitely something worth reading about if you're interested. But I do think these Williamson sisters did have some responsibility for what happened to them. Just some. It's really not their fault. It's Dr. Hazzard's fault, let's be real. But then there are also many people who let them down who could have helped out. The one obvious one is the state licensing board. But you've also got the nurses, the funeral home, the whole community of Olalla who saw what was going on, the governor, for whatever crazy reason, who pardoned her, and the coroner, who didn't do anything, said his hands were tied. I'd even say the post office let them down because they let the doctor intercept letters from the sisters, and I'm sure other patients as well. So there's definitely a lesson to be learned here, don't you think?
Well, yes.
I mean, do you think part of it could be just that people in general have a poor understanding of science? Because, I mean, you see it everywhere, drugstores, all kinds of so-called cures, and most of them are harmless, but a lot of them aren't.
Yeah, well, there's still too many people that are skeptical of science or don't believe in science.
Yeah, which is crazy. So our sources for this episode are some magazine articles, online magazine articles. One is The Doctor Who Starved Her Patients to Death by Bess Lovejoy, and that's from SmithsonianMag.com from October of 2014. Also from Science Based Medicine in December 2016, an article by Harriet Hall titled Natural Medicine, Starvation, and Murder, The Story of Linda Hazzard. Another interesting thing on the side, like I mentioned, is this Dr. Brzezinski. And I read a great article about him, and it's titled Personalized Gene-Targeted Cancer Therapy. Can he do what he claims for cancer? By David Gorski. That was written back in December of 2011. And then a big source was Starvation Heights, a book written by Greg Olson back in 1997. And that gave us a lot of our details. TCB's music was written and produced by Tristan Capel, and I'll just take a minute here for some housekeeping issues. Our beer review contest is winding down, and we'll be announcing a winner in May, so it's not too late to enter. You still have a couple weeks. All you need to do is record yourself reviewing a beer, just as Dick does in the beginning of our shows, and he will judge these submissions on personality, detail, and just the overall charm of the review. And the prize is a pair of my favorite Bluetooth earbuds that are waterproof and just great for doing anything. If you're interested in getting some ad-free episodes of TCB and giving us a little support, you can sign up as a subscriber and get an extra episode each month that's commercial-free. There's also this 3-year backlog of episodes, of course, and they're all yours to listen to as soon as you become a member. And once you sign up, there is some simple technology which allows you to add the members-only show, TCB Premium we call it, to your podcast app so you can listen on any device anytime, just like you do with the regular show. You can be a Tie Grabber member for as little as $4 a month, and when you join, you have your choice of a Welcome to the Brewery gift, which we will send to you with a thank you note. So just go to tiegrabber.com and click on subscribe if you'd like to learn more. So it's time for feedback, Dick.
Okay.
What should people do if they have something to share with us?
Well, there's lots of ways. One is to send us a voicemail. You can find a widget on the website, right side of the screen. Just click on that and record your message. Or if you don't want to send a voicemail, just record your message on your voice memo function on your smartphone. Paste that into an email for us. And in the event that you're too shy for either of those, send an email with your comments or suggestions to truecrimebrewery@tiegrabber.com.
All right.
Simple as pie.
Great. Thank you. Feedback.
So the first voicemail is a case suggestion from Jennifer.
Hi, Jill and Dick. This is Jennifer in Fort Worth, Texas. I just received my bottle opener, and oh my gosh. Not only is it beautiful, but it is so well made. It is just so classy looking, and I love it. Love the stickers. Love it, love it, love it. And I love listening to you guys so much. There is a case that happened here close to Fort Worth. Christina Morris in 2014 went missing after being out with friends in Plano in shops, legacy shops in Plano. She was having drinks with friends. She left. One of the guys, I don't guess she knew him very well, said he would walk her to her car. His name is Enrique Arochi, Arochi, and she's Christina Morris. So this was 2014. And anyway, they did not end up finding her remains until 2018. I think he's been charged with the murder, but this was a big deal here in Fort Worth. She was from Fort Worth. And it's just a case I've always been obsessed with, kind of. It was just, riveting. Always, you just always felt like the guy was guilty, but there was no evidence. And then things started happening. But it took 4 years before they finally found her. And anyway, I think Dateline may have done it. done an episode on them, but if you want to check it out, it's really a very interesting case. Again, it's Christina Morris and Enrique Arochi. But anyway, thanks again. I love the show. I love everything y'all do, and keep up the great work. Thank you. Have a great night. Bye.
Well, thanks, Jennifer. She's so kind.
Isn't she?
We have great listeners.
Yeah, I mean, that was a $20 well spent for getting her to do that.
Yes, it sounded good.
It was unsolicited. So just to go over a couple of things, the basic stuff. She was last seen walking with this guy, Enrique Arochi, in a parking garage at 4 a.m. In 2016, Arochi was convicted of aggravated kidnapping, and this was based on closed-circuit TV footage, cell phone data, and DNA evidence. Her DNA was in the trunk of his car. So he was sentenced to life in prison for that.
So that's interesting, for kidnapping, but not for murder because they never found her?
They hadn't found her. 2 years later, in 2018, they did find her remains.
Okay.
So that's the sequence.
So does that mean that they would then prosecute him for murder now? Or...
Well, I don't think so. I mean, they might, but he's sentenced to life in prison, so what else are they going to do?
Well, does life mean life, though? Because sometimes it doesn't.
Well, so that might be a different thing.
Yeah.
They'd re-sentence him to life in prison without parole.
Well, it's definitely worth taking a closer look at. Sounds like a good suggestion.
Yeah, that's why I picked it. I thought it'd be good.
Okay. So we have an email from Lisa with a case suggestion.
We do. Lisa is quite succinct. She says, I have a story idea. She gives us a link. And it's Justice for Cody Haynes. It's a Facebook group. And this is a little kid. He disappeared from his home in 2004 when he was 11 years old. His parents said he ran away, but his father is suspected of beating him to death and disposing of his remains.
Well, how horrible.
Very horrible. And the horrible thing is it doesn't seem like things are any closer to conclusion.
Well, we've seen this in other cases where a child is missing, and we're pretty sure that a parent has done something. But if they can't prove it, it's very infuriating. It's upsetting.
Certainly is.
Yeah. So I'd like to read more about that. Our next email is from Grace. And Grace writes, I just wanted to thank you for the goodies I received in the mail the other day. I'm so glad at last to have access to your extra content. I love your show. Together you tell such great stories. I do have a suggestion for you. I would love you to cover the Jennifer Dulos case. She was the missing mom from Connecticut who hasn't been seen in almost a year. Her ex-husband and his lover are the prime suspects. Fotis Dulos recently committed suicide, but the lover and an attorney friend of his are being held in connection with this case. It's a twisty one from my home state. So yes, I remember this. This is very recent. This is a mom with a lot of kids, right?
I think there's 5 kids, yeah.
I didn't know that her ex-husband had killed himself.
Yeah, that was just a couple months ago that happened.
Sure.
I mean, she disappeared or went missing in May of last year, 2019, and her husband was charged, also his lover and his attorney friend. And all 3 of them were charged. Fotis attempted suicide in January and died 2 days after that. So after his death, charges against him were dropped. But his lover, Michelle Troconis, and lawyer friend Kent Mawhinney, they're still charged.
But what a horrible thing to get involved with something like that, right?
Can you believe it?
If a man wants to kill his wife and then you're going to help him? It's just like that chick that was cleaning up the murder scene for the Kelsey Barrett case. You can't be much shittier as a person than that, right?
You want to charge them too.
Absolutely.
I know they made a deal with that person.
I know.
But still.
Yeah.
It's just...
That's frustrating.
It's offensive to me.
It is offensive. That's a good word for it, yes. Very offensive. You're always there to give me the right word when it evades me. I appreciate that. So you ready to wrap things up?
Wrap it up. We're packaged and the bows are ready to be put on. We're looking good.
All right. We'll see you next time at the quiet end. Have a good week and stay safe. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.